My name is Michael Gilmore. I am the Treasurer of the Samuel Griffith Society, and as Treasurer, it is actually a great honour to have the privilege of introducing a fellow board member as our next speaker this morning. I'm of course referring to a person who needs very little introduction in this room, being Professor David Flint. I met Professor Flint for the first time, I think in 1998, where he was speaking at a function for Australians for Constitutional Monarchy in Melbourne. And I've heard Professor Flint speak many times since, both within this society and at ACM functions. And there are two things that I've always found reassuring about Professor Flint. Firstly, his voice. He has a marvellous voice, and I always find it a soothing voice. But more importantly, more substantially, his intellect. He's very thoughtful. He always says something that is meaningful, as does every speaker, of course, at this conference. Professor Flint has a very impressive CV. He was the Dean of the University of Technology, Sydney Law School for 20 years. He's been Chairman of the Australian Broadcasting Authority. He has been Head of the Press Council. His CV speaks for itself. But you're not here to hear me speak. You are here, of course, to hear Professor Flint. Please, Professor Flint, please.
Thank you, Michael. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I shouldn't really be here. The Prime Minister has ruled that I am not a constitutional lawyer. He said so in his published diary, which was called, he published it straight after the referendum, it was called Fighting for the Republic. Julie and Lisa said it should be called Whinging for the Republic. It's better, I suppose, than the description of me frequently on one Republican site, until they realised I was making a lot of fun out of it, that I was a perma-tanned Indonesian-born blow-in. My subject today is an Australian Republic, yes, this is working. Strangely, in this hotel you can't have a computer on the lectern, so you have to have it away from you. An Australian Republic, more than a waste of time and money, a significant obstacle to constitutional reform. In other words, it's crowding out what we should be doing in relation to constitutional reform. Now, I have to admit to you that I am now one of the immortals. I achieved immortality 2 years ago when a team of television people came from London and they interviewed a number of people. The purpose was to take those interviews and put them in a vault, and it would be then used at the end of this reign. And it's for when they proclaim a new king in England and across the Commonwealth. And they asked me, why are you a constitutional monarchist? And I gave 3 reasons. I said, firstly, I'm a constitutional monarchist because of the service of the royal family. And I think that's best exemplified by the statement by the Queen Mother when the Germans were bombing London, and there's an evening blitz just about every night, and it was suggested that the princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, should be sent to Canada. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, said, they won't go without me, I won't go without the King, and the King will never leave London. And that, I think, exemplifies the service that the royal family gives. The second reason I gave, this is a very strange machine. Good. The second reason is I've sworn an oath of allegiance twice, and I don't think when you swear an oath of allegiance that you should easily break that. In the same way that if you go into court and you say that you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, you certainly should not break that. And my final reason was, of course, the Constitution, because that is the most important reason that we have. This doesn't seem to be working. The model we have, the Westminster model we have, is the only constitutional model in the world which has been exported successfully, lasting through wars and economic depressions. Even the French in 1848, this is so resistant, even the French in 1848 couldn't make an American-style presidency work. Within a very short period of time, the president had declared himself the emperor of France, and they had decades of authoritarian rule. The American model does not seem to work for long. Only the Westminster model works successfully when it's exported. Something is terribly wrong with this. Yes. Alex, could you help me? I wanted to talk in my paper about three things: the strengths and weaknesses of our Constitution, secondly, proposals for constitutional change, and proposals for real constitutional change. The second one is proposals for fake constitutional change. Well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Constitution? I think they're best put out by the great Sir John Quick and Sir Robert Garran in their book. And they really set out what the Constitution is all about. And they point out that never before have a group of self-governing, practically independent communities without external pressure or foreign complications of any kind deliberately chosen of their own free will to put aside provincial jealousies and join together because of a conviction of the folly of disunion and the advantages of nationhood. This was an extraordinary thing, and what is important is to remember that it happened very quickly. Under the Corowa Plan, which was settled at the conference at Corowa in 1892, it was decided that federation would not happen if we left it to the politicians. The Constitution, the draft Constitution from the 1891 Convention, went to the colonial parliaments. They could never agree. They wanted to change everything. If we had left it with the politicians, we'd probably be several independent countries rather than one. At Corowa, Sir John Quick, who should be remembered, he should be on every banknote in the country, he recommended, and the conference proposed, accepted, that in future conventions should be directly elected, and that once they had agreed on a draft constitution, had proper consultation, that would be put directly to the people. It wouldn't go through each of the colonial parliaments. And that is what happened. We did that in 4 years. We can't lay down tram tracks in the city of Sydney in 4 years. That's a 19th century technology. We did something really extraordinary then. Well, what are the weaknesses which desperately call for reform? First, and the founders would have been aware of this because it's in Hamilton's Federalist Papers. The first one is only the politicians can institute constitutional change. So they have a conflict of interest there. They're always thinking about increasing their power. In the American Constitution, the states, there can be a convention of states, and they can institute constitutional change. The second thing they made a mistake about, and they should have been aware that this was a danger, they gave the judges an unreviewable power to interpret the Constitution and to declare laws invalid. Now that had created enormous problems in the United States. Not so much in the first case, Marbury and Madison, where it was declared by the Supreme Court, which outraged Jefferson and surprised Hamilton because that had never been envisaged. It was the second case, which was an absolute disaster, that was Dred Scott in 1857. In 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States declared that slavery was protected by the Constitution and that slaves and descendants of slaves could never become citizens of the United States. That was a precursor of the Civil War. That disturbed the Missouri Compromise and any hope of compromise between the North and the South. It's surprising that the judges seeing that didn't do something about the High Court, that they didn't, for example, rotate appointments so that every state government took its turn to appoint a judge of the court. It's surprising that they didn't institute some way of reviewing decisions. The third weakness is that states in Australia do not rely on their own taxes. And they'd be warned by Hamilton in the Federalist Papers that every state should possess an independent and uncontrollable authority to tax and then to answer to its people as to how it taxed. The fourth weakness, I think, is it's too difficult for new states to be formed in Australia because you need the consent of the politicians of the existing state. And we have very few states compared with other federations. For example, Switzerland, which is much smaller than us, has 26 states, and there are communities of interest in Australia where there would be a viable new state, and the absence of new states is creating the excessive centralisation that you see in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne, and that could be so easily avoided by having additional states. The fifth weakness is the electoral system. The electoral system, the running of the electoral system, was centralised in Canberra. In America, it's the states that run the electoral system. This means that if there is a weakness in the system, for example, in the 1980s, a weakness was introduced, which has opened the door to more electoral fraud, that is the abolition of subdivisional voting. Once that was introduced, it was then introduced nationally and not just in one state, as it would in the United States. And the sixth great weakness is, I think, that our system of representative democracy can be too easily captured. And we see how it has been captured today by the two principal parties who are both dominated by cabals of power brokers who quite often conduct pre-selections which are pre-arranged where the candidate is chosen not according to merit, but the candidate is chosen because of his or her loyalty to a given power broker. Charles Kingston, the Premier of South Australia, had a proposal which would have weakened the role of the representative democracy and of the parties. Deakin talked him out of it. I'll put more details of that in my paper. Well, what are the consequences of this? The consequences of undermining federalism is massive waste and bad government. 80% of the taxes in Australia are now collected by the Commonwealth, and they give back about half of that to the states, and much of it on conditions. In other words, they tell the states how to spend the money. According to the Toomey-Withers report and the recent excellent IPA report on regulation, somewhere between 10 to 20% of the gross domestic product is wasted. It's money down the drain because of duplication and excessive regulation in our Commonwealth. And I'll put references to that in the paper. This leads, of course, to a decline in the quality of government. It leads, for example, in some areas where you have both the federal and the state government trying to run the same matter, it leads to what I would suggest is the two drivers syndrome. It's like having a car with two drivers. Education is a classical example. Both the Commonwealth and the states are trying to run school education. They don't do it very well. More money is poured in, and the consequences are that the standards are falling. Our standards in literacy, for example, and numeracy, are falling in comparison to countries to the north. In one important aspect, our standards are lower than that of Kazakhstan. Now, where you have these two drivers trying to drive the same car, someone else comes in sometimes and runs the show. And this is what's happened in relation to the curriculum. The cultural Marxists have moved in and they've had a major change in relation to school curriculums. Well, the next part of my paper on proposals for what I call fake constitutional change. And this is based on the proposition that the Constitution is a compact about the formation of the Commonwealth and then the governance of the Commonwealth. It's not about other things, it's about how to govern the Commonwealth of Australia. The people, nationally and federally, we have a requirement for a twin majority, they have to approve the change if there's to be a change to the Constitution. And I would say that change should only be made if it will improve significantly the governance of Australia. The Constitution's only about the governance of Australia. There's no need to bring in other matters into the Constitution, and if the proposal doesn't significantly improve the governance of Australia, it should not proceed. I found when I was looking at the 1999 referendum and people were saying, well, what if they put this referendum again? What if we win it? We get a victory about a republic and then they try it again. So I checked on the number of times the Commonwealth had put more than one subject in a referendum. And I found that there was an extraordinary number of these. In fact, some had been put up to 5 times. And these were about transferring power from the states to the Commonwealth. Now, apart from those which related to the structure of the Parliament, for example, in relation to the nexus between the Senate and the House, that the Senate should be half the size of the House, apart from those questions, in every case where the Commonwealth had tried to get powers from the people, asking them sometimes up to 5 times and getting a very clear no, I came to the conclusion when I was looking at it that none of these referendums would ever be needed now. The reason being that the High Court had given those powers to the states, quite often on the basis of the external affairs power. And we've had this extraordinary undermining of the Constitution. The proposed amendments that are on the table now would not significantly improve the governance of Australia. For example, there's one to change Section 44. If you look at Section 44 and you compare it to Section 47, you'll see that the politicians themselves could have solved the issue by coming to a conclusion as to what dual citizenship meant. There was no need for them to refer it to the Court of Disputed Returns. The only reason the High Court was made the Court of Disputed Returns 100 years ago was because the High Court didn't have much else to do. And it was the only federal court. But they couldn't have given it to a state court. If they'd given it to the Balmain Police Court, for example, they probably would have got better decisions, better interpretations of the Constitution than they got from the High Court. So there's no need to change Section 44 of the Constitution. It's a waste of time. The second one is this idea, this obsession that the Constitution, which is about governance, should be about recognition. And the recognition fashionistas have all sorts of ideas. For example, local government. Local government is a matter for the states. Local government was created by the states. It's a matter for the states. It has nothing to do with the Commonwealth of Australia. And then, of course, there's the recognition of Indigenous people, and heaven knows what in the future. For example, will there be recognition of people who are in a state of gender fluidity? Will there be some demand for the recognition of the alleged community of LGBTI, XYZ community, and so on? These are ridiculous proposals. They are a waste of time, and they are distraction. The latest one we have is, well, it's really about virtue signalling, isn't it? It's about virtue signalling by politicians and by CEOs of various corporations who are wasting their shareholders' money. But the latest one is to create a third chamber, and that's why I've got the House of Lords there, is to establish in Australia a separate chamber representing a group of people, the Indigenous people. This would create effectively another chamber of Parliament, because Fairfax and the ABC and most of the media would concentrate on those debates. They'd become big news, and if you didn't get the approval of the third chamber, you would be really in trouble in relation to all sorts of governance proposals. So as for House of Lords, or as the British had in India, they had a third chamber. It's called the Chamber of Princes, and that's what really this is all about. So there's a crowding out effect. When you concentrate on these issues, as we did, for example, over same-sex marriage, when the Parliament spent so much of its valuable time debating this issue, it crowds out the real issues which we should be attending to. the greatest festering proposal for change of them all is the Republic. And it's also something which can be very sinister. It's not for a real republic. None of the republic movements in Australia have ever proposed a real republic. That is, it's for a fake republic. It is for a graft of some sort of change to our constitution, which is essentially that of a constitutional monarchy. It's by fake Republicans. Most of the Republicans in Australia are not real Republicans, which I'll explain in a minute. And it's for a fake reason, that is, an Australian as head of state, and by a fake process, that is, the process through the plebiscite. Well, what is a republic? If you look at the Constitution of Australia, if you look at the preamble, you'll see that we've agreed to unite in an indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown, an indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown. And what is the word commonwealth but the English word for republic? That was what Cromwell presided over. Commonwealth is the English word for republic. That is, we are, as John Howard says, we are a crowned republic. On the screen you see Cardinal Moran. He was a great Cardinal Archbishop of Sydney in the 19th century. He stood for the Constitutional Convention. But before the convention he said this of the constitutional system in Australia. Before federation, this is the most perfect form of republican government in the world. The most perfect form of republican government in the world. If you look at the definition of a republic in the Macquarie Dictionary, you'll see that the present system that we have fits into definitions 1 and 2, and even in relation to the third definition, even in relation to the third definition, a state, especially a democratic state, in which the head of government is an elected or nominated president, not a hereditary monarch, you could arguably say that since the Prime Minister heads the government and not the Queen, we are also a republic there. The very strong argument that we are already a republic. As to most Republicans being fake Republicans, I exempt 2 people. They were on the Vote No committee appointed by Senator Minchin as Special Minister for State, who guided the process. And what the minister decided, very sensibly, was that the committee that administered the $7.5 million that the no case got and the yes case got, that each committee would be selected through a formula. That is the number of votes the organisation got in the convention elections. 2 Republicans came up, Ted Mack and Clem Jones, former Lord Mayor of this city. Ted Mack was an independent member of both the New South Wales and federal parliaments. He was strongly against politicians' superannuation, so much so that he resigned from the Parliament of New South Wales and from the federal parliament before he became due for superannuation, which is really a very honest way of following your beliefs. The Republicans, if they were genuine Republicans, would look at what is in the American Constitution. None of them ever refer to the American model. There are 2 great republics in the world. The 2 oldest republics in the world are the United States and Switzerland. And anybody in Australia saying they're a republican should be looking at the models there, learning from them, and making a proposal based on them, but they don't. And they should learn from the work of those who established the Republic, and in particular, after the war was won and the Federalists began to debate what the Constitution should contain, the work of the great Federalists in the Federalist Papers. You would expect Republicans to be very much aware of the Federalist Papers, to be constantly using arguments from them. They don't. They should also learn from the Swiss, that's the Swiss Parliament, especially the way they've worked out how to make the politicians accountable. But if they did that, they'd then realize that they wouldn't have to get rid of the crown. We could have the best features of the Swiss constitution, but keep the crown. So that's probably why they're silent on this. We've had 5 major Republican movements in Australia. They've all been fake Republican movements because they are not for the purpose of improving the governance of Australia. They're for the purpose, for some other ulterior purpose. The very first one was it was in the 19th century, and of course I can say this as a Permatant, Indonesian-born blow-in. It was for a white republic because it was against the massive immigration that came in because of the gold rush. That's a cartoon from the Bulletin. It shows you the attitude of the Bulletin and of those who wanted it. They were dismayed by the fact that the British had a very liberal approach to immigration. They allowed movement around the empire and from outside the empire. And they wanted to have an immigration power. And they thought the only way they could do this is if we seceded from the empire and became a white republic like some of the southern states. That was a major movement, but it disappeared once it was realized that with federation, we would have an immigration power in federation. The Bulletin was the flag bearer of that movement, and until I was in my 20s, they still had on their cover, Australia for the White Man. It was Kerry Packer that had it removed when he took over the Bulletin. The second great Republican movement was for a Soviet People's Republic of Australia, which began after the Great War with the formation of the Communist Party of Australia. And that was to bring all the joys and pleasures and delights of living under Soviet rule. They never made any electoral impact. There was a member of the state parliament, this state parliament in this state, who was a communist, but they never made any real electoral impact, but they had a major impact in the union movement, so much so that at the end of the war, they dominated the ACTU and they infiltrated the Labour Party, so much so that one of the ministers in the Whitlam government is widely believed to have also been a member of the Communist Party. Then we have the Keating-Turnbull Politicians' Republic. This was supposedly for a republic, but it had a very sinister side, which we tried to argue to the committee which was settling the referendum proposal in 1999. We argued that not only should the question contain details of how the president would be appointed, we argued that it was singularly important that it be explained in the question, not just in the text, in the question, how the president could be removed, because that was really sinister. And I remember raising this with Ted Mack. It was at a debate at Corowa against Malcolm Turnbull. I said to Ted, I can't seem to explain to the Republicans that they're doing something very dangerous in this republic. They really have to change this provision. Ted said, don't try. They know what they're doing, and this is what they want. It would have been the only republic in the world in which it would have been easier for the Prime Minister to sack the President than his driver. He could sack the President at any time without notice, without any grounds whatsoever, and without any right of appeal. It would have so developed the prime ministerial power. It would have been an outrage. 1975, for example, could never have happened under that situation. And they must have known what they were doing. They're clever people. They know this. Now, the next one, the next republic, is the current Republican movement, and it's as if they were marching down the street saying, we want a republic, but we haven't the foggiest idea what sort of republic we want. So it's an extraordinary constitutional demand. The demand to change, as Tony Abbott explained far better than me, as Tony Abbott explained, they're wanting a republic, but they're not saying what sort of republic we should have. So it is something very strange. They either have it up their sleeve or they genuinely don't know. And of course, there's also a call for an Islamic republic, which frequently is proclaimed from Lakemba. There's a call for an Islamic republic under Sharia law. Has no electoral impact, but of course, the terrorists who wish to disturb Australia do believe in that. Well, the fake reasons. There were a number of fake reasons given for this new republic. They were also embarrassingly silly. They've now been replaced by one. This is Al Grasby. Al Grasby gave us the reason for a republic, that the Crown creates unemployment, and if you had a republic, it would significantly reduce unemployment. How did he ever put that with a straight face? Not, I suppose, that Mr. Grasby's face was ever straight. Fortunately, he can't sue me now. Another argument was a republic will significantly increase trade. When people are engaged in international trade, they have two issues, quality and price. They couldn't care less what the constitutional system of the other country is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trading with China, would we? It's a one-party communist state. We wouldn't be trading with them. It is of no consequence whatsoever. So they found their silver bullet, the head of state. And that's David Smith's excellent book on the head of state. What we're really talking about here in relation to the term head of state are the royal, presidential, vice-regal travel rules. That's what head of state is all about. Because it tells us, it was say the term so obscure it wasn't in the Macquarie Dictionary, it's the Republican silver bullet. It has nothing to do with the Constitution. It's just a term used in customary international law to replace the previous term, prince. And it's all about princes moving out of their state, going to another state, and what they get there. They get recognition, 21-gun salute. They also have immunity from the jurisdiction. It's duplicitous, of course, to use that. Australians are not lying awake at night, wondering who their head of state is. And as I say, it wasn't in the Macquarie Dictionary at the time it was first raised. It was so obscure because it was a diplomatic term governed by international law. You really have to go back to the Treaty of Westphalia to work out what it was all about. And if I could paraphrase John Howard, what essentially was decided at the end of the religious wars in Europe is we will decide under which religion we worship and the church in which we worship. That was what Westphalia was all about. It was also to recognize the sovereignty of the different states of Europe, that they would have, of course, secure borders, that each state would be represented internationally by a prince, and that the prince would be entitled to two things. Just look at Elizabeth's great speech at Tilbury. I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe, it's a generic term, any prince of Europe. And you see that there in the late 19th century, most of Europe consisted of monarchies. South America had republics, but they didn't count. Europe was the center of the world in those days. So prince remained the generic term for what we now call heads of state. So Nicholas and the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg were both heads of state. They're both princes. So were Presidents Poincaré and Roosevelt. And you could have more than one prince or head of state. In England, we had William and Mary as co-sovereigns. She wasn't just his wife. They were both princes. They were equal sovereigns. And the generic term gradually replaced, the generic term gradually became head of state. As I said, it wasn't in the Macquarie Dictionary. In the Yes case in 1999, They used it 9 times. It is of crucial importance to them. And really, as I say, it's really relevant to international travel by viceroys and by presidents and so on. Here you see General Pinochet. The principle was, it's expressed there in the Latin term, which I won't go into now, a visiting head of state has absolute immunity from the jurisdiction. Tony Abbott read to you the decision of the High Court in 1907, in which it said, the Governor-General is the constitutional head of the Commonwealth. The Governor is the head of the state. The first use of the term head of state in a domestic constitution was in fascist Spain by Generalissimo Franco, which is an excellent precedent, don't you think, for putting head of state in the constitution. He became the Jefe del Estado. And fascist France followed. Marshal Pétain, not wishing to become a president because he was so opposed to the Republic, had himself declared as chef d'etat. Stalin, interestingly, was never a head of state. They were the presidium of the Supreme Soviet. You had a collective head of state of 36 people representing the Soviet Union. They're heads of state, that's a bishop with the president of France. They're the co-princes of Andorra. They're both heads of state in relation to Andorra. The captains regent of the most serene republic of San Marino, also heads of state. The Swiss Federal Council, collectively, the 7 of them are the head of state. Here we have a man on an elephant, that's Lord Curzon in India. When the Viceroy, who was also the Governor-General, he was Viceroy and Governor-General, went to visit any of the princely states, which were all independent, although they'd all entered into treaties with London to hand over their defence and foreign affairs to the British, he went as a prince, as a head of state. He received an exceptional salute, that is 31 guns. He didn't always go on an elephant, though. At the Imperial Conference in 1930, and subsequently Sir Isaac Isaacs became the Governor-General, but at the Imperial Conference, it was decided that in all essential respects, in relation to the administrative affairs of the Dominion, the Governor-General would have the same. The Governor-General would have the same, or would exercise the same functions as the King. In 1987, that's an interesting year, 1987, Sir Ninian Stephen made a number of state visits. State visits began probably in the 70s for Governors-General, and in 1987, Sir Ninian visited those countries you see on the screen. But in one country, the visit had to be cancelled because the president said, no, I won't be receiving you, the vice president will receive you. Now, somebody in the Australian embassy was playing a silly game and telling the president of Indonesia that the Governor-General wasn't the head of state. So on the advice of the Hawke government, the Governor-General decided to cancel the visit. Subsequently, the Indonesians apologized. Now, I can see I'm losing time, so I won't show you myself because I thought it was relevant to Indonesia. Don't you like that? They thought that I would be disadvantaged by that. That was on a Republican site. Now, Parliament too has declared the Governor-General to be the head of state. Look at that legislation there. And I also have something that I want to play to you. I should have to finish very soon because I see that time is running out.
National News at 2. Good afternoon, I'm Bo Mitchum. The Prime Minister says he made the right decision not to attend the repatriation service in Sydney. The remains of 33 Australians arrived home after being buried in Singapore and Malaysia following the Vietnam War. There's been widespread criticism over Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten's decision not to be part of the service, but Mr Turnbull says he didn't want to politicise the event.
The Australian government, the Australian people, were represented by our head of state, by the Governor-General.
They all Prime Ministers of Australia, Labor or Liberal, have held out the Governor-General to be head of state ever since they began going on state visits to other countries. So what we're being offered, and you'll see it in my paper, is a fake republic for a fake reason with a fake process. And I put in my paper some of the examples of plebiscites which have been so misused, and it is not something which should be allowed to continue, something for which I think Australians should say no, and I should finish on that point. Thank you.